That was a truly magical period in my life. Working there sometimes felt like living inside a dream. There were beautiful beaches, bright blue water, warm sand, and a completely different way of life. But while Sainte Marie looked like the perfect place to work on television, life behind the scenes was not always so simple. To viewers, the island looked like the easiest workplace imaginable. There was blue water, warm sunshine, beautiful beaches, drinks at sunset, and a murder mystery that was usually solved before the end credits. It looked like the perfect combination of a vacation and a job. But for the detectives of Death in Paradise, paradise was never quite as simple as it looked. Richard died there. Humphrey escaped because he found love. Jack left before his grief could completely take over his life. Neville eventually decided that he wanted a life beyond his fears and routines. And every time a detective left Sainte Marie, fans were left asking the same question: why? The answer is more interesting than simply saying that the actors wanted to leave. Sainte Marie changes every detective who arrives there. That is one of the biggest secrets behind the success of Death in Paradise. The show is not only about solving murders. It is also about watching damaged, lonely, uncomfortable, or emotionally trapped people slowly change because of the island and the people around them. Every detective arrives with a problem. Richard is too serious and controlling. Humphrey is messy and emotionally vulnerable. Jack is carrying the pain of losing his wife. Neville is extremely anxious and afraid of almost everything. Later detectives also arrive with their own personal struggles. Sainte Marie does not magically solve their problems. Instead, it forces them to face the things they have been avoiding. That is why the detectives eventually leave. They do not always leave because they hate the island. Sometimes they leave because the island has already taught them what they needed to learn. That is what makes Death in Paradise so unusual. Most detective shows build their entire identity around one main character. When audiences become attached to someone like Sherlock Holmes, Columbo, Morse, or Vera, the show usually keeps that character around for as long as possible. Death in Paradise did something completely different. It turned replacing the lead detective into part of the show's identity. Ben Miller played D.I. Richard Poole and left after 2 series. Chris Marshall then arrived as D.I. Humphrey Goodman. After him came Ardal O'Hanlon as D.I. Jack Mooney. Ralph Little later became D.I. Neville Parker, who stayed longer than many of his predecessors before eventually leaving as well. Then a new detective arrived again. Under normal circumstances, replacing the main character again and again might destroy a television series. Viewers might stop caring. They might feel that the show had lost its identity. But Death in Paradise turned that problem into its greatest strength. The show became a kind of emotional replacement ritual. Every detective arrived as a stranger. Every detective slowly became part of the island. And eventually, every detective had to decide whether Sainte Marie was still the right place for him. Richard Poole was the perfect first detective because he absolutely hated Paradise. That was the joke. Richard arrived from Britain wearing a suit in a place where almost everyone else was wearing light clothes and enjoying the sunshine. He looked uncomfortable from the moment he stepped onto the island. The heat annoyed him. The sand annoyed him. The food annoyed him. The relaxed attitude of the locals annoyed him. Even the beauty of the island seemed to irritate him because it was so different from the world he understood. But Richard was brilliant. That was the important part. He might have looked completely out of place, but when a murder happened, his mind became incredibly sharp. He could look at a room full of confusing clues and somehow notice the one tiny detail everyone else had missed. He was socially awkward, emotionally guarded, stubborn, and sometimes rude without realizing how rude he sounded. But underneath all of that was a lonely man who did not know how to relax. Richard liked control. He understood rules. He understood routines. He understood British police work. Sainte Marie was the complete opposite. The island forced him to deal with people who did not behave according to the rules he expected. Slowly, almost without realizing it, Richard began to change. He became closer to his team. He learned to trust Camille. He started to understand that Sainte Marie had its own way of doing things. He never completely turned into a relaxed beach lover, but he became more comfortable with the people around him. That made his departure especially difficult for viewers. Ben Miller eventually left the series for personal and family reasons. Filming the show required long periods away from home, and the production was based far from Britain. What looked like a dream job to viewers meant months of filming in hot conditions and spending long stretches away from family. The writers therefore had to solve a difficult problem. What could they do with Richard Poole? They could not simply have him say that he wanted to return to London. They could not easily send him away on another holiday. And if he simply left the police station, viewers might always wonder whether he could come back. So the writers made one of the boldest decisions in the show's history. They killed him. Richard Poole was murdered with an ice pick at the beginning of the third series. It was shocking. The man who had spent 2 seasons solving murders suddenly became the victim of one. For a cozy mystery series, that was an extremely dramatic choice. But it also sent a powerful message. No detective was untouchable. The beautiful island was not simply a vacation destination. The stories could actually end. Richard's death devastated fans, but it also gave the show freedom to start over. From that point forward, every new detective could be different because the audience understood that the show was not built around one person. Richard became the original legend of Saint Marie. Every detective who came after him was compared to him in some way. The serious personality, the uncomfortable suits, the dry humor, the impossible attention to detail. Even after he was gone, Richard remained part of the show's identity. Then came Humphrey Goodman. Humphrey had one of the most difficult jobs imaginable. He had to replace Richard Poole immediately after Richard's death. Many viewers were still upset about Richard's departure. Some fans did not want a replacement at all. They had become attached to the original detective and were naturally suspicious of the new one. If Humphrey had been too similar to Richard, he would have looked like a copy. So the writers did the opposite. Humphrey was almost completely different. Richard was serious and controlled. Humphrey was messy and nervous. Richard kept his emotions hidden. Humphrey showed almost everything he was feeling. Richard looked like he had been forced to move to the Caribbean. Humphrey looked like he might accidentally fall into a crime scene, apologize to everyone, and then solve the murder anyway. Chris Marshall brought a warm and lovable quality to the character. Humphrey was awkward, but he was never cold. He was kind, emotional, funny, and sometimes painfully uncomfortable in social situations. His mind worked in a strange way. He could appear distracted or confused while secretly connecting clues in his head. He became the first major proof that Death in Paradise could survive without Richard Poole. But Humphrey's story was not simply about solving murders. He also arrived with problems in his personal life. His marriage was falling apart. His confidence had been damaged. His life felt unstable. Saint Marie slowly became a place where he could rebuild himself. He developed friendships. He became more comfortable with the island. He started to understand that happiness could exist outside the life he had originally planned. For a while, Humphrey looked like he might be the detective who would actually stay. He liked the island. He liked the people. He had become part of the community. But eventually, Humphrey realized that what he really wanted was not simply a beautiful island. He wanted love and a future that felt right for him. That eventually led him away from Saint Marie. Unlike Richard, Humphrey did not need to die for his story to end. He simply moved on. And that became another important lesson for the series. A detective could leave paradise and still have a meaningful future. That idea eventually became even clearer when Humphrey returned in the spin-off Beyond Paradise, which moved his story away from Saint Marie and into a completely different setting. Richard's departure was about death and finality. Humphrey's departure was about possibility. Then came Jack Mooney. Jack was very different from both Richard and Humphrey. He was friendly, talkative, warm, and approachable. He had a natural ability to make people feel comfortable around him. That was useful when investigating murders. People often talked to Jack without realizing how carefully he was listening. He could joke with suspects, make them feel relaxed, and quietly observe their reactions. But behind Jack's friendly personality was a great deal of sadness. He was a widower. The loss of his wife had changed him, and Sainte Marie became a place where he could begin to heal. The island gave him a new community, gave him work. It gave him a reason to get out of bed each morning. Ardal O'Hanlon brought a special kind of warmth to Jack because viewers already knew him for comedy. But Jack was not simply a funny character. He was thoughtful, caring, intelligent, and emotionally complicated. His humor helped him connect with people, but it also helped him hide some of his pain. Jack's story was really about learning how to live after loss. And that is why his departure was so important. Jack did not leave because he hated Sainte Marie. He did not leave because he was bad at his job. He was actually very good at it. He had friends. He had built a life there. He had become comfortable. But sometimes comfort can become another kind of trap. Sainte Marie could have become a place where Jack stayed forever because it was easier than facing the next chapter of his life. Eventually, he realized that he could not hide from the future. He had to move forward. His grief could not be solved simply by living somewhere beautiful. You can heal in paradise, but you cannot hide there forever. Behind the scenes, Ardal O'Hanlon also decided that it was time for him to move on. His departure therefore worked for both the actor and the character. Jack had arrived carrying grief. He left ready to live again. Once more, Sainte Marie had done what it was supposed to do. Then came Neville Parker. Neville was almost designed to suffer on Sainte Marie. He was allergic to almost everything. He disliked the heat. He struggled with the food. He had very specific routines. He was uncomfortable with change and had a long list of fears and anxieties. At first, it seemed impossible to imagine him surviving on a Caribbean island. But that was exactly why he worked. Neville's story was different from the detectives who came before him because his biggest enemy was often himself. He was constantly worried about what might go wrong. He overthought simple situations. He struggled to adapt. Yet beneath all of that anxiety was an extremely intelligent detective. He could see details other people missed. His unusual habits sometimes became advantages because he approached problems from a completely different direction. Over time, Neville began to change. The island did not turn him into a completely different person. Instead, it helped him become more confident in the person he already was. That is one of the most important ideas in Death in Paradise. Sainte Marie does not magically fix its detectives. It gives them the opportunity to fix themselves. And eventually, Neville reached a point where he had to make the biggest decision of all. Was he going to stay in the life he had built, or was he finally brave enough to step outside his comfort zone? His decision to leave was not simply another actor departure. It represented the end of Neville's personal journey. He had spent so much of his life being afraid. Eventually, he realized that being afraid could not stop him from living. That is the strange magic of Death in Paradise. Every detective arrives thinking that the island is going to be a temporary assignment. They think they are simply there to solve murders. But Sainte Marie becomes something much more important. It becomes a place where they confront themselves. Richard learns to loosen his grip on control. Humphrey learns that he deserves happiness. Jack learns that grief cannot be allowed to control the rest of his life. Neville learns that fear does not have to make his decisions for him. And that is why the detectives leave. They leave because their stories have reached a point where staying would prevent them from growing. The island looks like paradise to the audience. But for the detectives, it is something much more complicated. It is a mirror. It shows them what they have been avoiding. And once they finally face it, they are ready to move on.